There was a tree that fed almost every pioneer family on this continent. It put food on the table in autumn, fattened the hogs, framed the barns, and paid the taxes when nothing else would. And then, in the span of about 40 years, roughly 9 out of every 10 of them vanished. By the time it was over, a tree that had numbered in the billions was, for all practical purposes, gone from the forest. If you have never tasted one, there is a reason for that, and almost nobody under the age of 80 has. Stay with me, because the real story of how it disappeared is stranger and sadder than most people have ever been told, and the work being done right now to bring it back is something you will want to know about. I'm going to walk you through what this tree was, what it did for ordinary families, exactly how it fell, and what is happening today. If stories like this matter to you, the kind of knowledge that slipped out of living memory in a single lifetime, consider subscribing because this channel exists to keep them from disappearing entirely. Let us begin with the tree itself. Its name was the American chestnut. Not the horse chestnut you see in city parks, and not the European or Chinese chestnut you might find roasted at a winter market. This was Castanea dentata, a giant native to the eastern forests, and it was once one of the most abundant large trees on the entire continent. In the Appalachian range, it was so common that botanists of the time estimated that, in some stretches of forest, 1 tree in every 4 was a chestnut. Picture that for a moment. You could stand on a ridge in what is now West Virginia or Tennessee, look out across the slopes, and a quarter of everything green in front of you was a single species. The numbers historians settle on are difficult to even hold in your head. Something on the order of 4 billion trees once stood across the eastern woodlands. These were not modest trees either. A mature American chestnut could rise well over 100 feet, with a trunk so wide that several adults holding hands could not reach around it. The old photographs that survive look almost staged, with men standing beside trunks that dwarf them like something out of a tall tale. And yet they were real, and they were everywhere, and the people who lived among them built entire ways of life around the gifts those trees handed down every single year. Now, before I go further, I want to be honest with you about something because it shapes this whole story. For years, the way this tale got told online leaned on a villain. Some shadowy interest cut the trees down on purpose, the story went, to make families dependent, to break their self-reliance. It is a tidy story, and it is an angry one, and it is mostly false. The truth is at once more ordinary and more devastating, and I think it deserves to be told straight. So that is what I'm going to do. But first, let me show you why these families loved this tree so much that its loss broke something in their world. The American chestnut was, before anything else, food. Every autumn, a single large tree could drop hundreds of pounds of nuts. A whole hillside of them carpeted the ground so thickly that, by some accounts, you could not see the leaves underneath. Families sent the children out with baskets and sacks, and what they gathered fed the household straight through winter. The nuts were sweeter and smaller than the imported chestnuts most people know today, and you could eat them raw, roast them on the stove, grind them into flour, or boil them into porridge. For a poor mountain family, this was not a treat. This was survival, arriving for free on a reliable schedule year after year. And the nuts did not only feed people. Farmers turned their hogs and their cattle loose into the chestnut woods in the fall, a practice old as the hills, and the animals fattened themselves on the mast at no cost to anyone. A family that could not afford grain could still raise meat, because the forest fed the livestock for them. When the time came to sell, those same nuts went to market by the wagon load and then by the rail car. In the towns along the eastern seaboard, roasted chestnuts were a fixture of autumn and winter streets. The song about chestnuts roasting on an open fire was describing a living, ordinary thing, not a nostalgic invention. Cash from the nut harvest paid debts, bought shoes, and covered the taxes that kept a family on its land. Now hold that thought, because there is something I want to come back to near the end of this video, a piece of the old knowledge that nearly went into the grave with the last of the great trees. For now, let me keep building the picture, because the nuts were only half of what this tree gave. The wood was the other half, and in some ways it was just as important. American chestnut wood was a near-perfect timber. It grew fast, it was light enough to handle, and it was extraordinarily resistant to rot, which mattered enormously in a world without modern preservatives. A fence post of chestnut could stand in wet ground for decades without rotting away. Barns, cabins, railroad ties, telegraph poles, furniture, cradles, and coffins were all made from it. There's an old saying from the mountains that a person could live their whole life inside chestnut, rocked in a chestnut cradle as a baby and buried in a chestnut coffin at the end, and almost everything in between framed by the same wood. On top of that, the bark was rich in tannin, the substance used to tan leather, and whole industries grew up around stripping and selling chestnut bark to the tanneries. So here's the full picture. A single species that fed your family, fed your animals, gave you cash at market, built your house, fenced your fields, and supplied a regional economy with timber and tannin. There has rarely been a tree so woven into daily life across so vast a region. which is exactly why what happened next landed the way it did. I want to pause here for a moment because if you are finding this worth your time, the simple act of subscribing genuinely helps work like this reach the people who would care about it. This is the kind of history that does not get taught, and it survives mostly because people choose to pass it along. Now, to the fall. The story does not begin with an axe. It begins, of all places, at a zoo. In the year 1904, a forester named Herman Merkel, working at the New York Zoological Park in the Bronx, noticed that the American chestnuts on the grounds were sick. Their leaves were browning, cankers were splitting open along the bark, and limbs were dying back. What he was looking at was something no one on this continent had seen before. It was a fungus, and it had arrived as a stowaway. In the decades before, nurseries had been importing ornamental chestnut trees from Asia, almost certainly Japanese chestnuts. Those Asian trees had lived alongside this fungus for so long that they had evolved a resistance to it, so it barely harmed them. But the American chestnut had never encountered it and had no defense whatsoever. The fungus, which we now call Cryphonectria parasitica, worked in a cruel and simple way. Its spores landed in any small wound in the bark, took hold, and grew a canker that spread around the trunk until it choked off the flow of life between the roots and the crown. The tree above the canker would die. This is the part that matters, and it is the part the conspiracy version always leaves out. Nobody cut these trees down to harm anyone. A microscopic organism, carried in by accident on imported plants, did what no logging company ever could have. And it moved with terrifying speed. The spores traveled on the wind, on the feet of birds, on the fur of animals, spreading roughly 20 to 50 miles a year through forests where, remember, sometimes 1 tree in 4 was a chestnut and could pass the infection straight to its neighbor. From that single starting point in New York, the blight rolled outward in every direction like a slow wave. Within a few years, it was across Connecticut and New Jersey. By the 1910s and 20s, it was deep into Pennsylvania, and pushing south into the heart of Appalachia, the very core of the chestnut country. By the 1930s and 40s, it had swept through the southern mountains. By around 1950, give or take, the wave had largely run its course, having reached nearly the entire natural range of the tree. In roughly 4 decades, between about 1920 and 1960, depending on the region, an estimated 3 to 4 billion American chestnuts died. Let me give you the human side of that, because the statistics do not capture it. Imagine being a child in a mountain holler in 1915, sent out every fall to gather chestnuts the way your parents and grandparents had. Now imagine that same person, grown, standing on the same hillside in 1940, looking at gray skeletons of dead trees stretching to the horizon, and knowing that the harvest that fed the family was simply never coming back. People described it as watching the forest itself die. And here, I have to address that question in the title head on. Why were so many cut down between 1920 and 1960? Because there's a grain of truth tangled up in the myth, and it is worth getting right. The trees were not cut to suppress anyone, but once the blight was killing them, they were absolutely cut down by the millions, and there were good reasons for it. A dead or dying chestnut still had valuable wood, and that rot-resistant timber stayed sound long after the tree had died, so loggers raced to salvage it before it degraded. This is sometimes called the salvage harvest, and it stripped the dead chestnuts out of the forests across the region. In some areas, foresters and officials also cut healthy trees deliberately ahead of the advancing blight in a desperate and ultimately futile attempt to create gaps the fungus could not cross. So yes, an enormous number of chestnuts were felled by human hands in those exact years. But the axe followed the fungus. The cutting was a response to a disease that was already a death sentence, not the cause of the loss. That distinction is the whole difference between an honest telling and a fairy tale, and I would rather give you the honest one. By the middle of the 20th century, the great American chestnut was, as a forest tree, effectively extinct. And here is the strange, stubborn part. It never completely died. The fungus kills the trunk and everything above ground, but it does not always kill the roots. All across the old range, chestnut root systems are still alive underground, sending up new shoots year after year. Those shoots grow into slender young trees, and then, almost always, the blight finds them too and kills them back before they are old enough to make many nuts, and the cycle repeats. So the species hangs on as a kind of living ghost, an understory shrub that can never again become the giant it was meant to be. Which brings me to, now, and to the part of this story that is genuinely hopeful. People did not simply accept the loss. For decades, researchers and a remarkable community of volunteers have been working to bring the American chestnut back. There are a few main approaches, and they are worth knowing. The first is traditional breeding. The idea is to cross the American chestnut with its blight-resistant Asian cousins, then breed the offspring back to American chestnuts over many generations, aiming for a tree that is almost entirely American, but carries just enough resistance to survive. Organizations devoted to this have planted hundreds of thousands of trees in test orchards across the country. The second approach is the hunt for survivors. Here and there, a few large American chestnuts have managed to live for decades, possibly because of some natural resistance or sheer luck of isolation. And researchers study and propagate these survivors carefully. The third approach is the newest and the most debated. Scientists, working notably out of a forestry program in New York State, have developed a genetically engineered American chestnut that carries a single gene, borrowed from wheat, that lets the tree tolerate the fungus rather than be killed by it. This work is real, it is ongoing, and it has been moving through the long process of regulatory review, because releasing a modified tree into wild forests is a serious decision that people quite reasonably want to get right. I'm not going to tell you what to think about genetic engineering of forest trees. Reasonable people land in different places on that, and you're perfectly capable of weighing it yourself. What I will tell you is that for the first time in a century, there is a real possibility that a child born today could grow old in a forest where the American chestnut once again stands tall. That is not nostalgia. That is happening, slowly, in orchards and laboratories, and on volunteers' land right now. Now let me come back to that piece of old knowledge I set aside earlier, the part that nearly died with the trees. It was not a secret formula or a hidden conspiracy. It was something quieter and, in its way, more precious. It was the whole body of practical knowledge that surrounded this tree. How families knew exactly when the burrs would split and the nuts would fall, how they stored them so they would keep through winter without molding, the recipes for chestnut bread and chestnut stuffing and chestnut soup that fed people through the hungry months, how they read the woods to know which trees would bear heaviest, how they managed the forest so the mass stayed reliable, how they cured the wood and split the rails. When the trees died, the reason to keep that knowledge alive died with them, and within a generation or two, most of it was simply gone, carried off in the memories of people who passed away. That is the real loss hidden inside this story. Not just billions of trees, but an entire web of living, working knowledge about how to feed a family from the land around you. And that is exactly the kind of thing this channel is here to recover and pass on, the practical wisdom that ordinary people once carried as a matter of course, and that slipped away faster than anyone realized. If that mission speaks to you, the best thing you can do is subscribe, because every person who does makes it a little more likely that this knowledge reaches someone who needs it. For those who want to go deeper than a single video can, I have put together a complete written guide that gathers this kind of recovered, practical, self-reliant knowledge in one place, organized so you can actually use it rather than just read it. You will find the link in the description below. If supporting this work and getting the full guide appeals to you, that link is the place to start, and you will be helping keep exactly this kind of history alive. Results and uses will naturally vary from person to person and from place to place, as they always have. And nothing here is a substitute for your own good judgment and local knowledge. Let me leave you with a picture to carry out of this video. A century ago, a child could walk into an autumn forest, fill a sack with sweet chestnuts, and never once wonder whether the harvest would come, because it always had, for as long as anyone could remember. That certainty is gone, and it was taken not by greed or conspiracy, but by something far smaller and far more relentless, a fungus that crossed an ocean by accident. But the roots are still alive underground, the work to bring the tree back is real and ongoing, and the knowledge that nearly vanished can still be saved if enough people care to carry it forward. That is why this channel exists, and that is why your being here matters. If this story moved you, subscribe so you do not miss the next one. Take a look at the guide linked below if you want to go deeper. And remember that the things worth keeping are usually the things we have to choose on purpose, not to forget. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next video.